Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Mess. So today I'm going to have what I think is going to be a very fun and exciting video for everyone today. This should turn into a lively but friendly debate in the comment section. I'm going to be talking about what I actually think is a retro game at this point in time, because honestly there's been a lot of discussion out there on the internet as to what actually qualifies as retro. And just recently I did a video on Dead Rising and talked about the fact that the game is 20 years old this year, and if it was in college it would be basically finishing up its sophomore year. And that, to me personally, even if it is a high definition game, is definitely retro. Before I get too far involved though, do me a huge favor, go down below, hit like and subscribe, and ring that notification bell. Definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined and want to support the channel, we got a Patreon link down below as well. But something like The Fireman here, released on Super Nintendo by Human Entertainment, that came out in 1996. The PlayStation and Sega Saturn were on the market at this point in time, but absolutely nobody would consider something like a Super Nintendo game anything other than retro. But of course, when the PlayStation 1 and Super Nintendo were on store shelves and getting games for each other in that period of time, no one would really think that the Super Nintendo was quote-unquote a retro console. My point is that honestly, in my mind, a lot of time can go by and a lot of things can change, or a lot of time can go by and not much can change whatsoever. So you kind of have to quantify what retro would even be. I have two barometers for what I would consider retro. One is kind of a maybe it is, maybe it's not, and the other one, in my opinion, absolutely qualifies something as retro. If it is 18 years or older when it actually came out, that to me is a retro game. If it can graduate high school, if it can go to war, if it can go to college, it's got to be retro. Because think of it this way, a college freshman today would have never played something like Dead Rising, or something like Mizerna Falls here, released 2 years after The Fireman, also made by Human Entertainment, and you have a completely different vibe going on. You've jumped from 2D to 3D, and obviously this is a generational leap over what the Super Nintendo could do, but nobody would ever say this game isn't retro because it is 3D versus 2D. But once we get to the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 generation of hardware, people cannot decide whether or not that is retro hardware and retro gaming or not. That's exactly what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to break down how those two sides kind of feel about it. Because if we take a look at a game, El Shaddai Ascent to the Metatron here, absolutely stunning, released in 2011. That means this year it can go out and it can get its learner's permit. But because of the stylized graphics here, if this released on PlayStation 5 or Xbox Series X, I don't think anyone would really bat an eyelash at it. Yes, the overall model complexity and the geometry and polygons is a little bit simpler than we would see, but when you get to the 360 and PlayStation 3 era, it really does depend on the type of game you're talking about, not just its release date. Because something like this, again, is absolutely stunning, but it's because it has an art style that becomes timeless. We see stuff like that in Jet Set Radio on the Dreamcast. Yes, definitely a retro game, but because of the cell shading versus textures, it just definitely holds up a lot better over time. So honestly, you can make the argument that games specifically could be retro or not retro if they're on the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. But the fact that something like Dead Rising is 20 years old at this point in time, when even I thought about that, it absolutely blew my mind, and I was very confused by that overall thought. Because again, this game came out in 2006. I had been out of high school for like 3 years. I was traveling, working, and skiing, and that feels like a lifetime ago. And even though this is a high definition game, this to me definitely is qualifying for a retro game status at this point in time. Because if it's 20 years old, it's got to be retro, at least in my opinion. But you tell me down below how you feel about this so far, because I really would be curious. And again, I don't want you guys to get angry and argue in the comments. This is a fun thought exercise as to exactly what retro is. Because think about it this way, as of this year, this game is absolutely 20 years old. It came out 20 years ago. And if you think about 2006 and subtract 20 years from that, you get to 1986. And even though I am using modern footage of Super Mario Bros. Remastered, Mario Bros. Came out in North America that year, 20 years ago, 1986. Think about the absolute massive leap between something like Super Mario Bros. On the NES and something like Dead Rising. That is how powerful hardware got, and that's where gaming went in a 2-decade period of time, and that is absolutely mind-blowing. Where you think about Dead Rising in 2006 versus games coming out in 2026, you realize they haven't changed all that fundamentally. But the real takeaway is we have changed fundamentally in that period of time, and I know we don't want to admit it to ourselves, but as we basically shamble through life, we got old. That is the reality situation. I was 20 years old when Dead Rising came out, and now obviously 20 times 2, I am 40 years old. Somehow in between that game's release date and me talking about it last week, It actually doubled my lifespan. That's insane. I've been on this earth for 40 years, and honestly, I don't feel any different than when I played something like Dead Rising back in my 20s. But if you take a look at something like the most modern Silent Hill remaster, obviously a modern game, and that kind of is the really interesting thought process, because I'm going to get a little bit into this further about games that came out the same year, some that would be considered retro and some that wouldn't be. Because honestly, between PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5, Xbox One X, and Xbox Series X, nothing really changes. Sure, the graphics get slightly better, but gaming is kind of solidified into this concept in our heads as to what a video game is. But back at the PlayStation 1 and even Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 era, people were still fundamentally playing around with this formula. Because something like this absolutely would be considered modern, it's high def, it has good graphics, and it is a really good remake. And honestly, the gameplay in some spots isn't really that different than Dead Rising, but the difference is 20 years, and that is absolutely insane. Well, technically 19, but it was the most recent footage of a modern game I had on my system. But there's something about the Xbox 360 era when you see kind of that lack of detail in the background that feels more retro aesthetic than anything else in my opinion. But here's the thing, a lot of people would argue Dead Rising isn't a retro game, and don't forget that came out in 2006. Well, you know what else came out in 2006? Twilight Princess, and I'm pretty sure almost everyone would agree that it is a retro game. If you don't agree, tell me down below and tell me the reason why. I mean, perhaps it's the fact that the Wii is traditionally a 4x3 system that has some 16:9 games and is a standard definition console, not a high definition console. But something like Twilight Princess stands up absolutely as good, maybe even better, than something like the original Dead Rising on Xbox 360. But this one I feel like everyone would say is a retro game, where a lot of people might argue something like Dead Rising isn't a retro game whatsoever. But then, if it's not retro, it also doesn't feel modern because it has the trappings and game designs of something that was definitely last generation, pre-PlayStation 4 and Xbox One X. Because again, Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 were very experimental consoles where developers made games that just kind of felt completely out there in some ways, where now those risks don't really get taken all that often from mainline developers. They really try to make some paint-by-numbers games, in my opinion, for better and for worse sometimes. But Twilight Princess and Dead Rising are basically the exact same age. Well, that kind of is the interesting thing when you think about this. You could basically part and parcel it out to individual games, because the footage you're seeing right here, again, Xbox 360 footage definitely looks way more impressive than something like Dead Rising. And that really is where these topics get difficult, and even I have a little bit of an issue deciding game to game what would be retro and what wouldn't be. You have to take it as a whole picture. The release year, the gameplay design, whether or not that design feels modern, or whether it feels something like borrowed from PlayStation 2 era stuff. Because at least with the skill tree here and all the different attacks, kind of feel like I'm playing a Final Fantasy game on PlayStation 2. Or something like Deadly Premonition, also on Xbox 360, it definitely feels more like a retro game inspired by a Silent Hill 2 or Resident Evil 4 than it does feel like a more modern survival horror experience. But honestly, I think it's all the better for that, because of being inspired and kind of hewing towards more of the gameplay hooks of the PlayStation 2, GameCube, or original Xbox era make this game all that more inventive. And you would not say anything about the graphics here that would make you think they are modern. So that really begs the question, Deadly Premonition, at least the original release, modern or retro? Because at this point in time, Deadly Premonition went and got its license and is driving around with its friends and starting to think about what its future is going to be like in college and beyond. And that, again, is insane. My oldest nephew is 15 years old, and that means he wasn't even alive when Deadly Premonition came out, and I bought it day one because I had heard it was supposed to be interesting, and I figured I would give it a shot, because again, 16 years old is actually really old at this point in time, and I don't know how those 16 years went by and my nephew, who I remember as a baby in a carrier, is now getting his learner's permit. Or something like Super Mario Sunshine, it can be a retro game or it could be a modern game depending on what graphical effects and overall mods you put on it. So is that what makes something retro or not how it looks? Because in something like Super Mario Eclipse here in Dolphin, with 4K textures and a bunch of mods, whether you're 4x3 or 16:9, this game isn't any less pretty or any less impressive than Super Mario Odyssey, and honestly, that is just my opinion, but Super Mario Sunshine is the best Mario game ever made in 3D, even if I get a ton of people don't agree. So is it graphics that make something retro or not? You tell me down below. Or take something like 3D Game Heroes, released in 2009. This game is now 17 years old, and that again is insane. It's getting ready to graduate college, but I would say from a visual standpoint, this thing, if released today, would absolutely get a ton of acclaim as far as the overall design, aesthetic, and vibe are concerned. But the gameplay style definitely is retro, so is that something that could make a game on Xbox 360 or PlayStation 3 hit that retro designation versus being a modern game, whether or not it's kind of using the retro gameplay design, obviously here the original Legend of Zelda, to kind of feel like a modern retro game? And the reality is there really isn't a good answer to this question until stuff like PlayStation 6 and Xbox, whatever the hell they call it, if it even exists, comes out, and we think to ourselves, okay, PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 are now 3 generations old, because don't forget, we're only 2 consoles away from those being the most modern hardware you could buy in stores to play video games on console-wise. But as far as the original Dead Rising is concerned, this to me absolutely is a retro game. It came out 20 years ago. It has a design aesthetic that feels more like a retro game than a modern game, and even if it is in high definition, and really showed us the promise of what these new consoles would bring hardware-wise. Every single time I play it, I am transported back to being a 20-year-old definite kid, not adult, traveling around working and skiing with all of my friends, drinking way too much and basically sleeping 3 hours a night. And honestly, I might still eat way too much because I am a Midwesterner, but if I only slept 3 hours a night, now I'd absolutely fall over because I have doubled in age. Basically, I just made this game because honestly, we're all hobbling through life now as older people, and everyone in the comments was just blown away by the fact that somehow 20 years had gone by between the release date of Dead Rising, because a lot of us remember picking that game up day 1, or at least month 1. But you tell me down below, Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, retro or not, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.